1, 2, 3, 4.
Hi, and welcome to the Vininspo podcast with me, Ed Merrison. This is where wine is a travel experience. Join us as we pick up bits and pieces, make new friends, and create memories that make our future interactions with wine, people, and places all the more meaningful and fun. My guest on this week's podcast is Bree Stock, Master of Wine. I met Aussie-born Bree a decade and a half ago in her Melbourne days when she was a super engaging WSET educator. These days she's living in Oregon where she and her husband Chad run limited edition wines. That's addition, as in the opposite of subtraction. Clever pun, see? Anyway, Bree brings enormous vitality to a number of roles, from educator to ambassador to a boundary-pushing wine grower. Before we go to Bree, this is a reminder to please take that small action to amplify the content you like, so it gets noticed, gets shared, and gets a chance to survive. I've had some lovely feedback on recent articles and podcasts, almost exclusively in person, via text message or by email. I really appreciate it, but sadly, it's the likes, shares, comments, and subscriptions online that keep this kind of work alive. And that goes for any creative output you treasure. Anyway, back to Bree. We talked about leaving Bris Vegas and heading for Hollywood North, when powdery mildew is a powder keg for an explosive love affair, Phoenix Rising, the market for Marquette, and the hopeful outlook for hybrids. Challenging the Burgundy hegemony with an influx of foreigners from Chenin and Trousseau to Castelao, Arinto, Juan Garcia, Godello, Mencía, and more. Couch surfing and harvest hopping in a quest to master the MW. Knocking the stuffing out of sausage fests and pushing women forward. How you don't need to have both feet in the Pinot Camp to know that Pinot Camp rocks. How the scrappiness of the first settlers endures with the Pacific Northwest's cool, fresh air of endeavour. When wide-eyed naivety can be an asset in sneaking past the gatekeeper, and treasuring a beverage that never fails to give a handsome return on curiosity. I started by asking where life began for Bree.
I mean, I grew up in Brisbane, or just south of Brisbane, in a little bayside town, basically. I think I was a fairly normal blue-collar family kid. Grew up in a cul-de-sac with, bush at the end of the street and riding our bikes and hiking in the woods and being out all day and not coming back until dark. And the type of things kids did back then, played with the neighbours and did silly things like dance a Stedfords for your neighbours and charged people money to do a little play. And I was probably a really painful child, actually. I really loved reading a lot. I think I got that from my mum, who was an avid reader, still is, but would read a lot, always, we were always sort of trying to travel and go somewhere, even though we were still just on our holidays. We were down to the beach and, hanging around with our cousins and that type of thing. So it wasn't an exotic childhood by any stretch, but I think it was fairly normal. And, we were allowed to kind of follow our, whatever we wanted to do. My brother wanted to be a surfer and I did all the dancing, swimming,
Were you precocious at school?
Probably, I guess. I don't know that I had that much self-awareness, really. I think I probably was. I remember I did get kind of in trouble a lot. I had an opinion on a lot of things, and I was raised with a lot of boys, All my cousins were boys. I was the only girl, so I was very much a tomboy and sort of just be argy-bargy with the boys and, question everything and be a little bit argumentative. I don't know. Is that just an Aussie thing? I don't know.
Maybe not. And were you relatively extroverted?
To some extent, although I do remember I think I got asked not to come back to ballet because on our first, a Stedford got on the stage and just stood there and cried. So I think it depended on the moment, really.
Okay, but that didn't put you off, did it? Because you got into drama a bit.
Yeah, I did. It didn't really put me off. I guess I just maybe was a little more naive and I didn't think that a lot of people were watching, or who cares, that type of thought process that this is just what you do, this is what people do.
You mentioned the books. Were you quite sciencey or were you mostly arty?
I liked biology a lot. I wouldn't say that I excelled in chemistry or that. I was much more an arts person. I really liked biology and I really liked geology as well. I loved, learning about the soils and, I don't know, just having that story of the ancient history of places, you know. I feel like that was what was impactful to me, but maybe also because it was storytelling as well, you know. So that was where I really liked, was probably the natural sciences more.
Tell me a little bit about how the drama progressed from doing acts in front of your friends to getting a bit more serious.
I mean, we had, you know, high school theatre and things like that. And it was a very small school that I went to. It was a small Catholic girls' school in the outer suburbs of Brisbane. It was not a grand, you know, theatre school or anything like that. But I always would have, you know, some type of role in there or be in the, you know, dance or cheer squad or things like that. And then it was really only kind of my gap year, if you will. I was wanting to just be somewhere else, and everyone was going to the UK, and that appealed because of, you know, the West End and all of that. But then there was something about the Pacific Northwest and Canada that really appealed to me. And at the time, in, you know, the late 90s, Vancouver, BC was really, you know, Hollywood North. You know, the Canadian dollar was so affordable compared to the US, and so there was a lot of filming happening up there, and all these really great sound studios and great acting colleges and schools and a lot of work. And so that was kind of the path that I chose to go down. And so, yeah, I headed over to Vancouver to go to school and study acting and work on film and TV.
And how did that pan out? Did you get some good roles? Did you get some good experience? Did you enjoy it?
I did enjoy it. It's a great community, very social. You can get really geeky. You know, there's always something fun happening all the time. You know, you're having fun, but you're still working, you know? And so being able to do certain roles and parts and really dive into other cultures, other characters. Also, the technical side of it was kind of demanding as well. You know, when you think about the rehearsal of lines and the fact that you have to, especially in TV and film, you know, you're often doing the same lines again and again and having to hit the marks in the right place and making sure you're getting, you know, the right responses from each other. And so that was kind of cerebral, I think, for me, was the combination of both. And we just had a really great community around us. That's how I got into restaurants as well. You know, I became first a host at a fine dining restaurant and then a server. And so everyone there also seemed to be in acting. And so we would, you know, cover for each other. If, you know, someone had extra work that was additional, you know, we'd give each other additional extra work. So we'd be on the set and being able to, you know, run lines and rehearse and everything on the set together. And then being on a restaurant floor, giving hospitality to people is kind of another form of taking on a role or a character, and you could really pick whoever you wanted to be. Being an Aussie who very much had to try to lose my Australian accent, you know, was quite challenging, and having to have speech therapy to lose my Aussie accent so I could at least be considered for roles. That was challenging. I did a couple of little things, like some small parts in like Romeo Must Die and Stargate at the time, and, you know, things like that. So there was, you know, lots of little parts and some independent films, which were really great as well, because you felt really scrappy. You know, you were borrowing equipment and doing all of this after hours, and, you know, or you'd only have a certain amount of money and you could only rent the space for this long or this building for this long. And so it was really scrappy, and I loved that.
Yeah, and are you particularly drawn to the movies as an art form and television writing?
Yeah, I mean, I guess less now, but I was. I mean, I loved Wes Anderson's movies and Terry Gilliam, and I would follow certain directors and, you know, who they would often have as muses and things like that. And so I definitely loved, you know, the Criterion collection of films is sort of my, you know, where I go to for my films. I don't have time for much of it anymore, but I really enjoy it still when I get the chance.
Okay, so on to wine. You mentioned that you came across that and I suppose concepts of conviviality and hospitality while you were in Vancouver. Tell me a little bit about how that's developed.
Yeah, I mean, working in the restaurant was it was just such a great experience for me, because, you know, Vancouver at that time, we just have, you know, we had so many different people from all over the world, all over the US coming in. And so you were just learning and connecting with people and, you know, finding out about all these different parts of the world and different accents and telling them about the Pacific Northwest. And the fine dining restaurant that I worked in, you know, we were more casual fine dining, I guess you would say. We were based based in a park. It was very beautiful. Our chef was one of the first who really started the 100-mile diet, or 100-mile cuisine, sort of farm to table cuisine. And she would be at farmers markets in the morning, and we'd have farmers pulling up at the back gate where we would all go into the staff room beforehand. And so we were always like connected and talking about all the fish runs we'd have, because we're on the coast. So we obviously had salmon season, and you start with Copper River salmon and sockeye salmon and all these different fish runs. And so that was a very easy crossover to wine for me. And my father was in seafood, and so I always knew like all the different like textures and flavors and styles and deep water fish and warm climate fish. And so it was really interesting to me to have all of the the salmon runs and all of the terroir of the Pacific Northwest on a plate. And then really quite a good international wine list, which in the 90s in Brisbane just didn't really exist, And so I had this steep learning curve of, my mum would drink wine, but it was nothing fancy, when I grew up. So I had just had this steep learning curve of realizing that, wow, there's this massive world of wine out there. And then the way that we were thinking about, putting food and wine together. And then we had the Okanagan Valley in BC as well, and how everything paired with the food and the farms from there. That was just something that was so fascinating to me, for being able to connect to wine and culture around the world. And, I was very fortunate to have an amazing female chef in the kitchen and pastry chef, and also a great female beverage director they were all just very welcoming. And if you showed interest, you were always welcome or invited to sit at the table if there was a winemaker in town and they had time to do a tasting, or bringing new wines on. You would get the big full tasting and staff training. So there was a real investment in the staff and making sure that we knew the stories and understood the wines, and then, understood what they would be best paired with as well. So that was, a good exposure.
Right. So I guess somewhere there's a gradual shift between the wannabe movie star and the wine person. How did that then start to become a little bit more serious, or when did wine take over?
Yeah, I think I was just so fascinated. It was the same as exploring a character role in a script, discovering Grüne Veltliner and all of the different versions of it, along these river systems, and whether it has botrytis or not, and how much, and just the history of some of these places really made me, I guess, shift my focus a little to not be so obsessive about the acting part, and started studying, my sommelier diploma and WSET courses over there. And my educator, or my teacher at the time, was also incredibly interesting as well, and just a great storyteller. And then also my wine director, started doing the MW program. And so that was really my first exposure to the Master of Wine program. But more than that, it was just, as a child, I loved these like choose your own adventure books. Do you remember those, where you'd like flip to a certain page and like choose, you could have 7 different endings for this story. And I remember just sitting at a table, and on the nights that she would close down the restaurant, she would say, okay, run down to the cellar and just bring me up 3 wines blind and pour them for me. Sometimes she would say, make them all red, or pick them all from the same country, or pick a single grape variety, but 3 different wines. And that was fun, to be able to go down and like rifle through and figure out, what Pinot Noirs I'm going to give her from where, and then to pour them for her. And of course she would allow us to, sit at the table and taste as well while she was blind tasting. And then to hear her kind of assess the wines and where she would think that they were from. And it just blew my mind that, you could think that, oh, this is from a river valley region, or this is clearly a coastal region, or this is definitely volcanic soil. Mind blown, And then so being able to see that in a glass of wine was just amazing to me, because then with learning about all the flavors and varieties and everything attached to it, then I also got to get back into geology and think about, how was this region created? What is the river influence, and what is the soil type there, and what's the elevation, and how close to the coast is it, and what are the wind impacts? And so it was like traveling the world through a beverage in a glass, and that was enough for me.
And that was Barb Phillip, was it?
That was, yeah. I believe she became Canada's first female Master of Wine. I think David Lake was Canada's first Master of Wine, and he actually worked in Washington State for quite a while with St. Michel.
Very good. So how long were you in Canada all up?
Probably close to a decade, I guess. 4 or 5 years in Vancouver. Yeah, working in restaurants, and maybe it was 6, I don't know. Definitely a few years. And then, yeah, doing all of my hospitality education. And then I went over to Nova Scotia and was there for nearly 2 years. And that was really a great experience as well, because I was in a very small town that was very, agricultural. It was on the Bay of Fundy, and it was previously an apple orchard area, but there had been a massive downturn in the apple market, and they had basically kind of gone out of business. And so all of this land was being purchased and changed over to other crops, and grapes were one of those. While I was working in restaurants as a sommelier there and in retail, I was also able to work with the university system while they were trialing certain grape varieties and, getting people to write tasting notes and does this make a wine of quality, and what are its characters, and what do you like about it, and why would this be a good wine, and that type of thing. So it was really eye-opening to me that you can just shift an industry, in the matter of several years. They started out as hybrid wines, and when I was there, the very first viniferas were just starting to get planted, and now that region is really one of the best in Canada for sparkling wines and traditional method sparkling wines. So it's quite funny to 20 years ago. And now I see it at Decanter, and it's like, oh, I know that. I know that winery was getting planted. Yeah, it's a good trip back in time.
That's very cool. And have you kept an eye on the Okanagan Valley over this time and how that trajectory's gone?
Yeah, I'm fortunate to judge Canada when I go to London for Decanter Wine Awards. And so I get a really good comprehensive exposure to all of the Canadian wines that get submitted. And surprisingly, Canada submits a ton of wines to Decanter, almost as much as the US does, which is mind-boggling to me because the US industry is so much bigger. But they really submit a lot of wines, and it's really nice to be able to sit and taste. And I get to taste with Barb again. I get to judge with Barb again because she's panel chair, and we get to judge together and talk about the wines and see how the region changes. And unfortunately, more than not, Okanagan is a lot of smoke impacted years recently. But Ontario and Niagara are really excelling with some amazing Pinot Noir and Cab Franc and Gamay and some really beautiful cool climate expressions. Always every year I get that dropped back into my career back there from 20 years ago. So that's lovely.
Christina Pickard was on the podcast a while ago talking about essentially the way that hybrids have gone from being a substitute for something better to actually being, in some senses, appreciated for what they are, but more than that, I suppose that the cream has risen to the top in some ways. Are you seeing that as well, that some of those things that you were just seeing being trialled at the time have actually ended up making some really good wines? Yeah,
I don't see that many hybrids coming from Canada in the judging that they're putting forward, but I do see it in the US, and it's one of the things that I really enjoy about, when I'm doing market visits and sales or doing Texom judging, is that I'll get to see some of the local wines, or I'll ask about the local wines, or a viticulturist will come to one of my tastings or masterclass and they'll bring one of their wines. And so I get to see Marquette and Phoenix and all of these other hybrid wines that are actually, quite captivating. And I never really understood the foxy thing that, Jancis used to talk about in the books. I could never really find that flavor. I guess because I'm not British and I don't know what foxes smell like, but...
I've never actually smelt a fox, but when it's related to that, what is it, the grape flavour that you get in slush puppies?
Yeah.
I am British and I had a few of those when I was younger and I love grapes. Really, really hated grape flavour all my life. Anyway, well, let's situate you back in Australia because we met 14 years ago in Melbourne. Obviously, there was a brief-ish sojourn back in Australia before you ended up where you are now. So tell us a little bit about your time in Australia the second time.
Yeah, I think I came back to Australia for probably roughly a decade, I guess, with a little bit of travel in and out at the time. I think I'd intended to go into restaurants and, being a somm, and there just didn't seem to be that much work, especially in Brisbane, for sommeliers. And so I ended up working as a sales rep for a distributor. And so I was working with a portfolio that had initially Angoves and some of Australia's, first wineries and smaller wineries and things like that. And then I moved over to, I guess, Australia's one of the largest family wineries, the Bortoli family, and started working a rep job for them doing key accounts. And that was where I really kind of got to interact with somms again and interact in restaurants, because I did have some retail, but it was more boutique and more fine wine retail. The wines that I really gravitated towards in their portfolio were the more terroir specific wines or regional specific wines. The wines from the Yarra Valley that were more cool climate, some from the King Valley that were, some Italian varieties that they were playing around with, and the Hunter Valley as well. And not so much of the bigger Riverland and those styles of wines that came out of there. So I really kind of had a great portfolio to work within, but that allowed me to get back into the somm world. And so I remember I was in Brisbane and I'd work with Peter Marchant, and, we started a somm group up there, and Pete was really instrumental in that and sort of connected us to the Melbourne guys and Sydney as well. And so when I started teaching WSET, I started in Brisbane. I think it was Meg Brodman actually, who's an Aussie MW. She had reached out to me knowing that I had my WSET from doing it in Canada. No one else really had it in Brisbane, and so I was able to teach it. And I loved teaching about wine because, again, it was just kind of like acting again. It's, being in front of a class and, trying to get people excited about wine and the systematic approach, which can be incredibly dull and dry and repetitive, And then, giving people wines that you get to talk about and get to engage in and try to tease out some fun from that. So that was really how I got into, I guess, the somm world in Australia and teaching in Australia, which I love. And then I moved down to Melbourne and started working for Scott Wasley at the Spanish Acquisition, and also was teaching WSET for Prince Wine Store and those guys. And so really worked to try to build that program with Meg as well. And then Kate McIntyre as well came into the picture. We had kind of the three girls who were all doing the education. And then, I got to be in all worlds because I was a sales rep for a Spanish Acquisition. I also got to do great tastings and importing wines, but I was able to, still get in front of all the, geeky somms and talk the talk and have fun that way. And then be a little more basic with WSET, but, it was really training a lot of the hospitality staff. I mean, I still love doing that. That's part of what I still do today, for the Pacific Northwest wine regions and California. As I love telling the stories and training staff and getting staff excited about, why these wines are important and why they have a place. And I think that was when we met. And we just had a great group in Melbourne of not only somms, but really good importers, I think, that were stirring things up and bringing in just great European wines and telling the stories, classical regions, but also like natural wines, real wines, and it was such a juxtaposition to, honestly, a lot of Aussie wine felt like. And it was great also at that time to see sort of the shift in Australian wines, because you ended up having all of these winemakers that were young like us and going and traveling to different European countries and coming back and having these great wines in the restaurant and then starting their own little brands, but making it the same way that they did in Burgundy or Austria. And that was just a really exciting time, I think, in Australian wine as well. We have the big show system, which is good and bad, but it was also the start of the young guns of wine competitions, and just felt like a good time for Australian wine moving into being a little more honest and less just sunshine in a bottle, like could have been from anywhere,
Yeah. I mentioned it to you the other day because I didn't know that you were a rep, and it struck me as slightly incongruous part of your CV at the time, but I kind of see it now. Obviously, when I met you, was in a classroom, and you were very memorable because you were so full of enthusiasm, knowledgeable, but also really insightful in a way that probably reflects your quite varied background and how you've connected with wine. The rep side, I just couldn't see because there is sometimes a salesy breed, and you don't seem as salesy. But I suppose it makes complete sense that having been in the somm sphere, relating to wine that way, being out in vineyards from quite a young age and putting it all together, that farm to plate kind of idea as well. And just the general travel enthusiasm that actually makes people relate to it quite easily. Spanish Acquisition, I've mentioned that Scott was recently on the podcast. Where was Spanish wine when you were there? What was the perception of it? What was hot what was coming on the stream?
You know, Scott at the time, I think, was really starting to lean into the farming standards, so organics and biodynamics, and really thinking about what we put on the soil and, you know, the irrigation practices and all of those types of things. And that's what Spanish wine wasn't, you know. I mean, Scott was a somm in Melbourne as well, you know, wrote great wine lists. I think he also was and probably still is a disruptor. And so, you know, he was trying to make a portfolio that was a modern Spain portfolio, moving away from all of those incredibly aged, over-extracted American oak, kind of exhausting, you know, Spanish wines, you know.
Great word for them.
And, you know, there's wines like that are amazing that, you know, we definitely had in the portfolio. I mean, you'd never say that about Vino Tondonia, or, you know, even Cune is a fantastic classic, but it still has fruit and it still has that tension, you know, but just not the very traditional kind of style of wines. So he was very much bringing the new Spain into Australia. Yeah, I mean, it seemed very modern Spain at the time, but then also as his knowledge and love for the regions really expanded, I think he moved more into more honest wines as well. You know, it was like, 2009, 2010, 11, 12. It was still the Parker years, you know? And so I think it was somewhat a rejection of those sort of big oaky fruit bomb Parker wines, but I would say there was still a lot of polish to some of the wines that were being brought in. And then I think the more time he spent there and the more wines that we would just get sent and the way that we would blind taste everything for samples, we ended up, you know, sort of coming to a conclusion about what a wine was that would get our attention and warrant us putting it aside or having the other person look at it. And, you know, those were really wines that weren't so oaky and flashy, and they really showed something interesting and authentic and natural about the grape and the place and the style. They weren't super boozy wines, and they weren't all the enzyme-laden Albariños, you know, that were coming out at the time. They were really thoughtful wines that you could see the soil and the place through. And so that was fun to even be a part of that portfolio and see how that changed in just, you know, several years. Yeah, Scott's amazing. You know, he's very much a Renaissance man, and the way that he loves to write and think and talk about wine in a very romantic way, you know. I think you see that in his notes and when he's talking about a region as well. And it was a really great experience for me to be able to work with him.
And from there, a couple of things kind of happened around the time that you were leaving Australia. One of those was the MW, and the other was spending more time in vineyards. So we take on the MW?
Sure.
What was your journey like with that?
I mean, I finished the WSET diploma and kind of rolled straight into the MW. I feel like there's a part of me that is always just, I don't know, maybe just a little naive about everything. You know, the way that I was a rep and I'd just walk into, you know, because I didn't know a lot of these restaurants and chefs and somms and everything. And so I would just walk into restaurants and talk about the wines or, you know, talk to people. I kind of did the same thing with the MW. And also I had great women to support me as well. I'd seen what Barb had done. Meg was like, you should just do the MW and just, you know, stop and just sit the exam. And so that was, you know, good support to have, to just be given that confidence. Like, you know your stuff, you're a good taster, just get it over with and do it. You love this. It did become pretty apparent to me in that sort of first year that there was a gap in my knowledge, and that was really in the vineyard and the cellar. I'd tasted wines for so many years and had great experience with, you know, understanding regions and tasting widely, and had good structure tasting, obviously, from the WSET program. But when I was trying to answer winemaking questions or vineyard questions, it kind of just sounded like I was regurgitating from a textbook, you know, and it wasn't connecting the dots as much as it needed to be. And so that's what I really worked on. I was like, and I learned by doing, you know. So, you know, I did a couple of winemaking classes, you know, when I was in Melbourne at the university, piecemealing classes when I was back, and then would go out to vineyards, and then I would work in the cellars as well. And so, you know, I remember talking to Mac Forbes and, you know, him saying, you know, when I go to London to sell my wine, you know, I visit, you know, Justin Knock, who's an Aussie MW over there, and his wife Lenka, who's now an MW as well and was in my class. You know, he was like, you know, they just have so many tastings and they have access to the wine regions of Europe so close. Go and work harvest and then, like, couch surf in London and taste all the South African wines and all the Chilean wines. And so that's kind of what I did. And I mean, the MW program, I think it's a program where you have to be pretty honest with yourself. If you're really trying to be in it to pass it, you have to be really honest with yourself. You have to be tenacious and you have to do the work. So I was just, sign me up and I'll go and do harvest. And so that's kind of what I did. I did harvest around the world and worked in vineyards where I could, and, being out sampling grapes and hiking vineyards in the Douro and Germany. And it was an experience and really no substitute for that learning curve of, being able to connect the dots of this is what comes from the fruit, this is what comes from the land, and how you make a wine. And you can make a very four-square wine with a lot of, industrial university style winemaking if you're making mass production wines that are going to sit on a supermarket shelf, and be shipped around the world. That was never super interesting to me, and I don't think it is to any sommeliers, those style of wines really. So I always, sought out smaller producers who were doing something a little interesting or something a little different or had a real history, and you could get to be hands-on and you didn't just get stuck in a lab for harvest. You would actually be doing all of the fermentation work and also, doing some lab work, because you need to be able to see the chemistry to link it to the flavors in the fermentation and to understand, fermentation, heat and extraction processes and oxidation and, desiccation of fruit and all of the things that come with making wine. And I think that once I started doing that, that was just, I would do that and then come back and teach and just kind of piecemeal my life until I sat the exam and passed my MW. So partly within that was my last year of the MW, I did harvest in Oregon. And so that was really how I ended up here, was that I passed the MW program at the same time I was here, and then just kind of fell in love with the region here and saw a lot of opportunities to be able to, I hope, contribute to this region and contribute to the future of it, the future resilience of the region, in a way that I kind of felt that it had already been done in Australia, that this was still a place that I could have a hand in some of the change and some impact, because it's a pretty small region and it's pretty parochial, and they didn't really seem to have the same culture that we did in Australia as young winemakers, where everyone would go around the world to do harvest as well. There just wasn't that many people doing that here, maybe because it's a younger region as well. I got here and was like, wow, this valley is amazing. And the Willamette Valley, there's so many microclimates and so much rainfall, you still don't need irrigation. And so there's just a lot of opportunity, and I was just kind of mind boggled that there wasn't more grape varieties planted here. Great Pinot Noir, we all know that, but it's capable of so much more. This is the fun that I'm having here.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I want to zoom out again before we zoom in, because I really want to get into what you're doing in the specifics of it in a second. But first of all, you've mentioned the Pacific Northwest a few times, because obviously Vancouver's where you started and you've ended up becoming an expert, but also the Pacific Northwest is very dear to your heart. You spend a lot of time there and you're championing it all the time now. It's actually a corner of the world I've never been to and have longed to for a long time. Is there a vibe to that whole area that you kind of feel, something that knits together your experiences of Northern Oregon, Washington, Vancouver, etc.?
I mean, I think there's definitely a cultural mindset and cultural terroir maybe that comes in here. It really is the last frontier of the US that got settled, and, the people that settled here were, I guess, the scrappiest and most entrepreneurial people. The way that they had to get here was pretty impressive to survive it for a start, and then to actually be able to make a life here as well. So there's definitely a scrappiness and a sort of I'm doing it my way type of vibe here, which I think I love. But there's also a real energy. I don't think you can live in a place that is this beautiful and not be incredibly connected to the land and the trees and the rivers. And so there's a real outdoor culture, and there's a real self-sustaining, we're going to grow our own food, culture here. And I think that's really charming. And it's all the way, from BC BC all the way down to California. And, and then you also have the Asian influence as well, which I really love. Obviously being in Australia, we have such a huge, Vietnamese and Cambodian community. And, we have a huge Filipino and Vietnamese community here and everything being Pacific Rim as well. So I think there's some similarities to Melbourne, which I love, and to the food scene. And then, Vancouver was just really where my eyes were opened to intentional food and wine and convivial living and, really living with intention and being able to walk the talk here and do that yourself. And I think kind of that's what appeals to people here, is that you can still do it your way and you can still be pretty innovative as well. I think there's definitely an innovation mindset here.
Well, cool. Let's talk about that then. What you're doing now, you're doing your way. What is your gig all about? And tell me a little bit about Chad and how you both work together.
Yeah, so limited edition wines, I started in 2018. I had come here in 2014 and 15 and did harvest with Bethel Heights. I did Pinot Camp, which, really gets everyone, wherever you're from, wanting to move to Oregon because it's just beautiful.
What's Pinot Camp? How does that work?
Pinot Camp is put on by the Willamette Valley Wineries Association. It's focused on bringing trade from all over the world, and it's only for trade. I mean, there's maybe some media, but it's really for like salespeople, for distributors and hospitality professionals. And it's 3 days of intense, and I mean intense. It's like 8 a.m. until 8 p.m., 10 p.m., master classes around the different soil types here, the different AVAs, master classes of Pinot Noir, different vintages. That's the beauty of this place as well, is that we still have vintage variation. It's lovely. And then, now obviously Chardonnay is in with that group as well. It's all led by winemakers, and, we have a good set of wine educators here that have done either part of the court, a lot of the WSET, or the Society of Wine Educators, and just very passionate about this place. And as a group of winemakers and growers, everyone works together quite well. And I think that's also why the region has done so well so quickly. They had a thing called Steamboat that they started back in the 60s and 70s, where it was only winemakers invited, and that you would bring your wines and sit around the table and taste and discuss. And, you'd bring your problem childs as well and, figure out like what was going wrong and why this wine was good and this one wasn't. I think Pinot Camp is an extension of that, because from a winemaker standpoint, that was their Pinot Camp. But then, this was the first place where Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris were really established in the US. And so very different to Napa and Washington, styles of wine. So there was a lot of education required from a very young American drinking palate, which has obviously changed now, but it's a really great program. Yeah, if you ever get a chance to do it, should definitely say yes.
Right.
If you go to the WVWA website, the Willamette Valley Wines website, I think there's a tab on there that says Oregon Pinot Camp, and I think you can look at all the study materials and stuff that they present. And you have your alumni, if you will, that go back several years. I still go into markets today, and like a woman that I met the other day, she's a buyer and has her own store, and she's like, oh yeah, I was on 2014 Pinot Camp. And I was like, I was 2014 Pinot Camp, green bus. She's like, I was red bus. So it continues. It's a really good industry education format.
Pinot Camp sounds awesome, but obviously it didn't make you a pure Pinot fan because you're spreading your wings further. Tell me a little bit about the other things that you're getting into and why.
I mean, so many things can become a bit of a problem because it's hard to say no. But really what I first noticed here was that this is just an amazing growing region. We get ample rainfall in the winter and spring, very dry summers, but not exceedingly hot. You have a cold ocean influence, so you have really cooling breezes. I mean, if you can grow the level and quality of Pinot Noir that's grown here, and Chardonnay and Alsatian varieties, it just struck me that why can't you grow here as well, Syrah and other varieties? And so I started asking people, like, what else is being done here? Is there anything else being done? You're a 50-year-old region. Like, hasn't someone planted something else? And that was finally how I got connected to Chad, because he was trying to do some of this work already, more because he'd been working here for a decade and had worked with some of the great wineries, Antica Terra, worked at a really great vineyard called Johan in the Van Duzer corridor. But, they had a ton of Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris and were starting to get kind of not being able to sell all of their fruit every year. And so he saw that as an opportunity to graft to some other grape varieties that he was interested in. So he grafted Grüne Veltliner and Blaufränkisch and some of these Austrian varieties that you would assume would do very well because they also have Pinot Noir planted in those regions as well. And then before I had met him there, I had done harvest at Bethel Heights and felt the same way and had learned that Bethel Heights back in the 70s had Chenin Blanc planted and that Dick Erath had planted Merlot and Cabernet. And it was really just that Pinot Noir got like a competition attention, and that was kind of how Pinot Noir ended up sticking. But I would be standing on the crush pad during harvest at Bethel Heights and feel the Pacific Ocean wind in your face and smell the like kelp and the pine forests and the Doug firs. And it reminded me of Ribera Sacra, and the Douro Valley. And so I started looking into some of these regions as terroir cohorts for this region, because you can get rainfall data, growing degree data, wind, velocity, all of these things. And so I started mapping them out across regions that I loved. I love Mencía and Ribera Sacra and Bierzo, and found that it lined up almost identically. And then I was able to convince a grower, that Chad was working with to diversify their vineyard, convince them that Mencía should be considered here. And so we were able to actually find some plant material, and so we planted the first Willamette Valley Mencía. It's one of my favorite wines every year, and now there's, maybe half a dozen vineyards that have Mencía here. And it's incredibly expressive and is a fully ripe wine at 12.5% alcohol or 12% alcohol, and has amazing texture and energy and spice and aromatics, and is just beautiful. And so, off of that success, I started looking at, I do wine education here. I came here originally after finishing up harvest in, the Yarra with Mac Forbes, and got hired by the Oregon Wine Board to be their education director. And so I spend a lot of time with industry, with growers and winemakers, and understanding what the growing conditions are and what the challenges are and those types of things, and telling those stories. And more I was, telling this story, and everyone's comparing Willamette Valley to Burgundy, and it's like, but that's just a little simplistic. This is a 3.5 million acre AVA with only 50,000 acres planted. There's a lot that can be done here. And maybe isn't this more like the Willamette Valley is around the Willamette River watershed. It's a little bit more like the Loire than it is Burgundy, which is just tiny. We leaned into Gamay and Trousseau and Chenin Blanc. Chenin Blanc here is phenomenal. Cabernet Franc. And the climate has changed so much in 50 years here. Pinot Noir used to ripen in mid-October here. Now it ripens at the end of August and early September. And we have this amazingly long runway of a beautiful autumn and fall that we can ripen Chenin Blanc, Sauvignon Blanc, Cabernet Franc, all of these later ripening varieties, but they're still in a very fresh and interesting and very food-friendly, cool climate style, and very unique and completely different to California styles and to Washington wines. So it's been really fun to be able to continue to expand the narrative. And, the vineyard that I'm sitting at right now, Consonitas, that Chad and I helped plant with friends of ours, we ended up planting next to Trousseau. We have Mencía and Castelao and Juan Garcia and Albarino and Arinto and Gadeo and Sauvignon and Chenin Blanc, of course, and Aligote. Part of it is you just want a more interesting place to drink as well. And just being able to see what a place can do is really exciting. And especially as the climate continues to change, erratic vintages, wildfires. You don't want to be reliant on a single grape variety. It's, dangerous.
And you mentioned before we came on air, you'd been checking the Chenin Blanc because you'd had a frost down there. Obviously, as you say, weather challenges do exist, and the ones that you're adapting to apart from anything else with that diversity in the vineyard. Tell me a little bit about those vintage conditions and vintage variations. And I suppose your allusion to the Loire Valley as well means perhaps embracing how vintage plays with your wines and brings further character to what you're doing?
The teens here were some of the hottest first vintages on record, and you saw very big, ripe styles of Pinot Noir. And so that was, a consideration for also, like, maybe we should be considering grape varieties that ripen a bit later as well, or moving Pinot Noir to higher elevations to get a little more detail and freshness in them. And then, of course, 2020 happened, which was wildfires and decimated mostly all of the Pinot Noir in the Willamette Valley. And then 2021, we had a crazy heat dome in June that, resulted in very small yields and small berries. And then 22, we got a frost, a rare once in 100 years inversion frost that, damaged the early budding varieties, Chardonnay and Pinot Noir again. And so, every year it's been almost a validation that you're on the right track. Keep planting different things because the climate's just getting too erratic. And you're able to make, some years fantastic Cabernet Franc and Chenin Blanc. And I get to work with Chenin Blanc on a site that's very wind-derived and marine sedimentary soil that gives a very, dry, concentrated style of Chenin Blanc. And then another site able to develop botrytis on my Chenin Blanc and get a very different Loire style from that block of Chenin Blanc. So there's a lot of complexity that can happen here. The vintages after that, 23 and 24 and 25, have actually been pretty moderate and really stunning vintages that I think have a lot of, almost a reference to a more classical style of Willamette Pinot, sort of before the big hot boozy vintages. But, this year we have all been a little nervous because we haven't had a lot of rainfall and we haven't had snow this year. And so, snowpacks are very low and, we're obviously all, saying under our breaths, oof, wildfires could be a thing again this year. And then because it has been so dry and warm, the vines have woken up about 2 weeks ahead of where they should be. And so normally frost isn't an issue here, but it is if the vines are waking up so much earlier. And so, that's another consideration and just farming.
Now, I'm going to pick up on a couple of things that you said. A post that I know got a lot of attention around International Women's Day, things that you wish people had told you before you embarked on a career in wine. Some excellent advice there. One of those mentioned the MW. So the MW is not the final destination, it's a door. What doors have opened up to you from that, and how do you use those to, I suppose, bring out everything that you've learned and what you can give to other people and where it can take you?
It does open a lot of doors in terms of being able to, the biggest thing is it opens a door to almost any winery in the world for you. And as someone who loves to travel and loves wine, and geek out, that's the best thing about it. It's also the network that you have then as well, because, no MW is the same. Some of us are buyers for the monopoly in Sweden. Some of us are chemistry, UC Davis researchers. Some are, importers in London, like some are winemakers. We're all over, and it's just such an interesting, complex community of wine-loving people. That's a great door to open, and to have that type of connection and ability opens a lot of doors to new experiences that I would never have had otherwise. And then I think the other thing is, you do get to, really indulge in what you love. You get to then be really geeky about whatever it is that you want to do in the wine world. It sort of gives you your validation for whatever it is that you really want to follow down. And for me, it's also about, I get to work with amazing MSs as well, and other educators and wine writers and critics and, beautiful regions of California that have these beautiful old vine vineyards and mixed black vineyards that, we're still learning about. And, Morgan Twain Peterson is an MW whose dad had, Ravenswood, and he now is DNA testing every single vine in some of these old vine vineyards. And, just the geeky things that you get to do. It's a real door opener. Yeah, and I think it also is a way to bring other women and people who maybe normally aren't connected in the wine world. What I thought wine was, you had to be born into a wine family, By having people like me as an MW, it shows you that you can be in this world and you do have value in this world and you do bring interesting and different perspectives to the table. And so for me, I think it's try to always be encouraging of that and try to make sure that we're continuing to expand our wine world and have more interesting people in it continually.
What a great thought. Yes, and obviously we're having this conversation partly because of the influence that you had and the inimitable energy that I came across back in Melbourne when I first met you, and also the fact that Noah Chichester from the Wines of Galicia mentioned that he had tasted your Mencia and how good it was when I interviewed him for the podcast. But you mentioned a few people as well. I suppose the influences of Meg Brotman, Mac Forbes' advice to go to Europe, Steve Webber, Leanne Bortoli at Bortoli, and the influence that they had in terms of bringing ideas or tapping into ideas and giving things a go. And of course, Barb Phillip and others. That idea of mentorship, or not even really mentorship, maybe that sounds too formal, but just that idea of pushing people along. There are a lot of people out there who do, as you just said, want this world to be interesting to more people and to let people know that their ideas are welcome and that they can make it all better. Giving back is a really cheesy, cliche thing to say, I think, but it's that idea, isn't it, of pushing ideas forward and seeing what we can do that sort of drives you a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you have an idea or, your palate loves something, there's no reason why, you have to be following or mimicking someone else's or something else, and I think giving people that confidence and that support, I think that's what I got from, Steve and Leanne, being able to start Rosé Revolution with them and them getting behind like some pale, dry rosé idea that I had, to be able to sell more rosé and barrel fermenting Pinot Noir rosé and things like that, they were just supportive. They said yes. I think having that mindset of let's try it is really important to keeping the industry fresh and keeping new people in it and not being gatekeepers. I think there's so many gatekeepers in so many industries that prevent things from moving along more quickly and from them being more inclusive and more interesting. And so I think that's just probably what I try to bring to it, because I've always had that door open to me if I showed interest, and I try to do the same in return, be generous with my time as much as I can, and to get people excited about not gatekeeping and not holding onto your knowledge, like sharing the connections that you see in things, whether it's a flavor profile in a wine, or I remember Chad and I connected because I tasted his Grüne Veltliner in barrel, and I said to him, how much powdery mildew did this Grüne Veltliner had when you fermented it? And he was like, how did you know it had powdery mildew? I was like, well, I worked in Austria and they don't oversort their fruit, it's part of the terroir of the place because it's part of the vintage. He went to, Fresno State, for his enology degree, and all the university systems were just taught to be so precious and to strip away everything and then build it back up instead of being curious. And so, he had followed something on his intuition and instinct, and he had the ability to do that because it was his brand. He wasn't reporting to anyone else. But I think giving people that permission to be curious and to play. I remember Steve Webber did that with Bill Downey, encouraged him to go across to Europe and to do Burgundy harvests and come back and do a 100% whole cluster fermentation, and not pump it over or punch it down, like giving people that freedom to play and to be curious is really important to, I think, any great industry and the continuation of any great industry. And I think that's probably what excites me most right now about US wine is that there's a lot of boundaries. There's a lot of gatekeeping and boundaries that have been dropped right now. And we can love Marquette or a country wine, a fermentation of fruit and grapes, and that can have as much validity and be as delicious as, a Grand Cru Chablis or a Musigny, like we can geek out about everything. But as long as I think you're coming at something from a point of interest and a point of true curiosity and good intention, I think that this is where the magic happens, I think that's how you bring other people into this space as well, is because they can see your enthusiasm as well.
Yeah, we definitely can geek out over everything, although I'm not sure how many couples have had their fire lit by powdery mildew. I think that might be relatively rare. Just going to home in on a couple more points that you made briefly in that same forum. One was being the only woman in the room isn't a disadvantage, it's information. Use it. What did you mean by that?
I guess sort of in the same way as there tends to be, when you only have a certain single demographic of person, the conversation tends to be the same, and you tend not to have a whole lot of more interesting concepts. And it's sort of, the continuation of the navel gazing or, patting each other on the back type of behavior that doesn't really bring anything new. And I think by observing who's in the room and what's being said and how people respond to your presence in the room as well, and then how, when they maybe learn who you are or what you do, and then how that shifts or how it doesn't, can tell you a lot about an industry or about a place and where the opportunities are for change, I think, and maybe where things are not changing because of lack of awareness or a lack of observation. I think that's more what I meant by that. And also it inspires me to continue to recruit more women and more diversity in that room, because, a sausage fest can get pretty boring really quickly.
Yeah, but I think that that's an entirely valid point, that, those self-fulfilling prophecies or those self-perpetuating myths or that patting on the back stuff, you do observe things that are being missed, and I guess it can make you feel isolated no matter which minority you're in. But it also is, to a degree, potentially empowering, because as we're seeing all the time in the world, those things that are the status quo are often not only wrong, but they're pushing themselves further and further down a path that you can be an alternative to, which is something that, even in the Willamette Valley, much as you love it, there are things that you're finding that can be done differently. The other one was, and I think that this is, again, a little bit liberating for people that you teach, and you've alluded to where this comes from. That is, the most important thing you can develop isn't your palate, it's your confidence in your palate. Those are very different things. If you could just elucidate a bit more.
The same people having the same conversation, just it ends up in, homogeneity of a style of a product. I remember there was a Clonakilla tasting that Tim Trevor were doing at Circa the Prince, and it was, all the big wine writers and, winemakers and everything, and I was working the floor that night, popping bottles and tasting and everything. And the one wine that stood out to me, the one Syrah or Shiraz that just had so much rotundone and energy and space and air and expressiveness, and didn't feel like the same cookie cutter example that was on either side of it. This was 25 years of Clonakilla, and there was 2 wines in there like that. And I went and I asked him, these 2 are amazing. What happened this year? And I remember what he said to me. He was like, that was a fucking shit year. We got frosted and that was the worst year. They're the worst wines. I was like, well, they're bloody good right now, and they're the most unique wines. And so that taught me, and of course then, everyone started, picking earlier and, doing more whole cluster. And that was kind of the shift in Aussie Shiraz, cool climate Shiraz. But yeah, these wines got frosted, and so he lost the first buds. And so it pushed the ripening window of those next clusters 3 weeks later. I mean, that still teaches me something today, but it taught me something then that, you can get cellar palate really quickly. Just because, you're a legend and a great winemaker, it doesn't mean that you're always making the best expression of the wines. And it was really nice to see vintage variation on 2 wines out of 25,
Yeah, well, I have to say, I love the way your brain works, and I love the way you put things together, and I love the way you express it. So it's no surprise to me at all that in the 14 years since I met you, you've just gone and done better and bigger things. And thankfully really getting out there as well and putting your influence and your thoughts about. I think this whole conversation is almost an endorsement of this anyway, but I'm going to ask you to try and sum up what it is about wine that you love, that you wish that more people got to enjoy, or the thing that gives it value that you wish more people realise that worth.
I mean, it's such a magical beverage. It's the only singular beverage that changes every year with every season, and you only get to do it once a year, and within every single glass of every wine, I feel there's a cultural history and terroir and perspective. There's the environmental, that you get to think about, the climate, the agriculture, the tenacity of the people, whether the farmers or, landowners or the vineyard stewards, and then the people in the winery. It's just such a human beverage. It requires so many people to actually get it into the glass, and so many stories. And I think if we could just slow down and have a little bit of mindfulness when we're opening a bottle of wine and having a glass of wine, and thinking of it more as, this time capsule of a place and year and season. And you can think about that from the wine's perspective, from the region's perspective, and the people who make its perspective. And then you can also think about it from your perspective. What were you doing in your life at that time when this wine was being made and raised in barrel? And what does it make you feel? I don't know of any other beverage that can really bring such excitement, giddiness, mysteriousness. It's a magical beverage, and it's the only beverage that keeps teaching me. It's the only industry that keeps teaching me. It changes every year. You're never gonna master it. It's constantly changing. As long as you stay curious and open and don't try to control it. I think it's one of the best lessons in life is a glass of wine and the philosophy in a glass of wine.
I mean, you mentioned that it's a time capsule, which is obviously said a fair bit about wine, but there is definitely a thing, when I ask winemakers about what was going on when the grapes were picked for a certain vintage, obviously they have to cast their mind back, and you see them really thinking about what it was like, not just the season, but who they were at that time, what was going on in the world around them at that time. And then when you bring that wine out and drink it, things have changed, the culture's changed around you, what the hot topics are of the day, or the way that things are perceived through a lens of what's happened in between then and now, how that changes. And it makes me think as well about what you're doing. When you went to Pinot Camp, you were very excited about Pinot, and I'm sure still are, and still taste beautiful wines. But also, Aligoté, which was a quiet bet on a grape no one wanted at the time, is something that's really exciting people now, Mencia and all those other things. Time in so many ways is wrapped up in this. It's not just the wines that change, but we change and the world changes around us while we drink, think, share, taste, and talk about these things.
It's so true. You can geek out on different clones of Pinot Noir, different small vineyard plots, but, you can also just bring people to the table and have great conversations around a bottle of wine as well, and a glass of wine, and to be able to continually contribute to an industry, to how people interact with it, to give people permission to be adventurous, innovative, curious. I hope that's what people see in the wines that I make. I want wine to be accessible to a lot of people. My best-selling wine and the wine that I make the most of is from Skin Contact Pinot Gris. It's an orange wine with Muscat and Riesling. It smells and tastes like, Sunny D for adults, Fanta for adults. But it reaches so many people, and it's just it's so obvious, but it's so delicious and so fun. And I think sometimes we can make it all a bit too serious, and I think that's what really is detrimental to the wine industry. And so I think, trying to keep in mind that where I started in wine and what I used to drink and where I am now, it's a continuous journey, you just have to be open to it and have people who are not gatekeepers who will open their minds and cellars and everything to you. And that's the beauty of the wine industry. I think it retains that curiosity in people and continues to spark that fire, and I think otherwise you don't last in the wine industry. I think having those types of wines that people can connect with, it doesn't have to be super serious. It can just be delicious and can just bring people together.
That's it for this week's podcast. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and share it everywhere. Please don't underestimate the power of these endorsements in making it possible to produce original, thoughtful work. You can also subscribe to my Substack. That's edmerison.substack.com. For now, I'd like to say thank you to Lucas James for the music, Neil Williams for the artwork, Patricio Garcia for additional editing, and to my guest, Bree Stock MW. Till next time, live wine to the fullest. Cheers!